but our need for that community still exists. The last night before he was going to be betrayed and crucified, he could have done all sorts of things. He chose to spend that night before he would die around a table with his closest friends.
Why that speaks to my heart is when you consider the people at the table and their brokenness, when you consider that there's people who struggled with anger and people who had different political opinions and people who had no business being at this table. This is still the same table that's responsible for a good majority of the scripture you have in your hand today.
I have to say it's so good to be back. I was gone last week because I was in Oregon graduating with my master's degree. Yeah, thank you. I'll take that. It was a lot of work. And then I did this amazing thing called go on vacation. It was incredible. I went with 4 of my closest friends from my cohort. We went out to the coast in Oregon, and we actually Zoomed in and watched online the service last week because it was still hard to be away from you guys. But it was such a good time to be with these women who have become some of my closest friends. And as we reflected, we call ourselves the forgotten cohort. Because when you walk into our seminary's reception area office, they have pictures from orientation of all the different cohorts who started all the different years. And it goes 2019, 2021. They didn't even put a blank frame up there for the 2020 cohort because we did not get to go out to this beautiful waterfront orientation. We got to spend 2 days on Zoom for orientation, and they didn't even take a screenshot. And then for the whole first year, the way the program works is it's called a hybrid program. So I would be on Zoom class every week, live, everyone there at the same time. But then 1 week a semester, we were to fly out to Oregon and do classes in person. But for the first 2 semesters, fall of 2020 and spring of 2021, we did Bridge Week on Zoom, which if you've never taken an 8-hour class on Zoom, you are missing out on something I hope you never, ever have to experience. And so when it was finally time, almost a year and a half into this degree, to be able to fly out, I kind of felt like I knew what to expect because I'd gotten to know my classmates a little bit by then. We'd been in all of these classes. They used, the breakout rooms and the discussion posts. And so, I knew who they were, kind of knew their stories, their situations. And really, I just thought I knew what I was getting in for. But something changed when we got in the room together. And it wasn't really in the classroom setting because that was still exactly what it had been like on Zoom. It was what would happen when it was time for a lunch break. And instead of just closing my laptop, walking 2 whole steps to the refrigerator to make a sandwich and then coming back, I was walking down the road with some of my classmates to sit around a table and talk about our lives and talk about what we were thinking about the stuff that we were learning. And then at the end of the day, it wasn't shutting the laptop and just crawling into bed with my mind exhausted from Zoom fatigue. It was going back to the Airbnb and sitting around longer until all of my West Coast friends would laugh as my brain would shut down. And they could call the moment that they were like, you need to go to bed now, and it's 6:30, but you need to go to bed anyway. Because there's something that changes when you gather around a table. I wish I knew exactly what it was about it, because then I could write a best-selling book. But there's just something innate in us that changes when we sit around eating together, sharing stories together at a table with other people. We connect with them in a way that we were created to. And even though that's what we were made for, we're living in a time where it feels like we're moving away from that. So I want to do just a little thought experiment. In your mind, think about where you live, whether that's an apartment building or a house, and think about your immediate neighbors, across and beside, maybe behind, maybe diagonal, or in the same stairwell. For me, it's like we have doors with 8 units in a stairwell. How many of them can you name? Just kind of think about it. And this is not to throw shade on anyone, because this is just as humbling an exercise for me. Even intentionally trying to get to know my neighbors, I realized I can only name half of them in the 8 units that I live in, because we're living in a time where we're kind of backing away from community with our neighbors. Now, I live in a neighborhood that has been around forever. It's the Elizabeth neighborhood. So if you've been around, you heard us talk about it a lot. We did the Elizabeth Collective. We had a bunch of prayer walks to get ready for it. And so I did all of those prayer walks, and then I also did prayer walks on my own, and then I did regular walks for exercise on my own. And basically, I know my neighborhood really well now. And you can tell just by walking by when the house was built, because if it's been there, for about 100 years since the neighborhood was built, the house will have a big front porch. Might have a porch swing on it, some rocking chairs. There's a lot of space for people to gather. And then if you keep going, you'll see houses that were built maybe 20, 30 years ago, and they have more of a stoop than a porch. Like there's still a good front yard and an open space, but there aren't really seats there. People aren't planning to gather there. I call it the Amazon landing space because it's just where all the packages pile up that get delivered during the day. And I am that neighbor who will peek and try to see what you ordered. I don't steal packages, but I'm very curious. So if you're my neighbor and you don't want me to know what you've ordered, don't get Amazon packages while you're not home. But then you see the ones where they've knocked down houses and built them more recently. And some of them have built these giant fences around the front door or the front yard, and you can't see through them. Or maybe they're a little bit more, cultivated, and they use hedges to make it that way. But there are houses that you can walk by, and from the sidewalk, you can't even see that person's front door. And it's because we've moved from this time of community where, 50 some years ago, people would get home from school and get home from work, and they would go outside and see their neighbors, hang out, eat together, gather together. When we were little, we all played kickball together out in the front yard. We combined 3 front yards for an epic kickball field, and I never won, but it was really fun still. And then there are all sorts of guesses that people have and studies that have been done for why, and I don't even think it really matters why, but between garages becoming more popular so people can drive into the garage and then go straight in the house without even seeing a neighbor, or TV and internet and all of this entertainment that's available to us inside our homes, information that's available inside our homes, and then our concern about safety and the way that the world has changed. We've gone from a culture where it was normal for kids to get home, drop everything, go outside and play until supper time, to a culture where the kids come home after they do their activities. It's probably already getting dark, come home, do their homework, game, watch TV, and go to bed without even going outside and seeing neighbors. We're moving away and drawing the shades on our community, but our need for that community still exists. Dr. Martin Luther King said it this way. He said, "People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other, and they don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other." I was talking to someone in the lobby after the first service and telling her how I used to have this neighbor who lived underneath me who played really loud music, and he was not my favorite person. In fact, I would get petty to the point where I would run the vacuum if his music was loud, because I'm sorry, that's the person your pastor is sometimes. Or I would even maybe work out, do a little stomping and jumping, because it really bothered me, and it seemed to always be at the worst possible time. And then during COVID, when everyone was forced to be home, only a few of us stayed in our building. And so we started going outside and having picnics that were socially distanced in the front yard, but together. And I got to know him. And as I got to know him, when the music would come on, I didn't consciously decide to feel differently, but I'd be like, "Oh, Stephen's home. That's nice. I hope he had a good day." It just changed everything, because there's something that changes when we know people. There's power around a table or a socially distanced picnic blanket. And Jesus understood that power. The last night before he was going to be betrayed and crucified, he could have done all sorts of things. If it were me, I would have thought, how do I optimize this time that I have left? He could have done the Sermon on the Mount Part 2, gathered people to hear all of his last teachings. He could have gone down to the synagogue and read the scriptures and explained them to people. He could have gone out into the streets to find people who needed to be healed and performed miracles all night long. But instead, we read in Luke 22 that he sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." He chose to spend that night before he would die around a table painted it in the moment after Jesus said, one of you at this table will betray me. So if you look at it, they're all like, who is it? Is it me? Is it you? What is he talking about? You can kind of see that they're all kind of driven to confusion over this. And I love that chaos of it. The other thing that I love, like I said, the individuality. We can think about the disciples as this like united group of people that we lump together, but each one of them was an individual that Jesus found and called and brought to his table. So we have Bartholomew on the end, and then James the Lesser. How would you like if you were in a group of just 12 people and your nickname was James the Lesser? But that's him. After that, we have Andrew, and then here is Judas, who would end up betraying Jesus later that night. We'll talk about him in a little while. Peter, who we talk about all the time, including in a little while. Then we have John and his brother James, James the Greater. He definitely won that nickname battle. This is Jesus in the middle. I am assuming you guys knew this. Here is Thomas. Thomas is the one who would later doubt that Jesus had been resurrected until he was able to see him on his own. And then this poor guy, I think it's Philip. I always forget Philip. This is Philip. Then we have Matthew, Jude, and Simon. And what I love about this, shout out to my after party friends who are in my after party small group, is we know that Matthew was a tax collector, which meant he was like basically on the side of Rome. And Simon was a zealot, which means he was like, we're going to use violence to get rid of Rome. It would be like someone on the very far right and the very far left sitting at a table together, because that's what Jesus does. That's the power of the table. Now, I want to spend a little time on James and John. So James the Greater and John. These guys had the nickname Sons of Thunder. Like, talk about an Avengers kind of name. If I had a nickname, it would be Daughter of Thunder. But really cool until you read that it's actually because they were angry all the time. They were known more for their temper than anything else. These were the guys that made everything a competition. They were always just flying off the handle. Everything was the end of the world, and they were going to bring justice however they wanted to. And you see this in Luke chapter 9. It says, as the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers ahead to a Samaritan village to prepare for his arrival. But the people of the village did not welcome Jesus because he was on his way to Jerusalem. When James and John saw this, they said to Jesus, Lord, should we call down fire from heaven to burn them up? Like, these are the guys you want on your team, right? Like, burn them. These are disciples of Jesus, sons of thunder. They were angry. They're the ones, like if you go to Thanksgiving dinner, these are like the uncles who sit down and want to talk politics the moment that you sit down, and they're just like spouting out arguments that you know they think about over and over again, and you were like, this is the only thing I didn't want to talk about, but they just bring it up, or they have their one issue, you know, that something sets them off, and they get going, and they don't even like need you in the conversation. That's how these guys were, and then it gets worse, because they were also mama's boys. In Matthew 20, I kid you not, they had their mom come to Jesus and ask if one of them could sit on his right side and one of them could sit on his left side in heaven. They got their mom involved. Now, if you have studied the words of Jesus, you know that wasn't the way to go with Jesus, and he turned it into a lesson on the greatest becoming the least and the least becoming the greatest. But come on. Mothers in the room, happy Mother's Day. Please raise children who don't need you to tell their boss they need a promotion when they're in their 20s and 30s. So that's James and John, sons of thunder, mama's boys. Then we have Peter, who's one of my personal favorites. He was a fisherman when Jesus found him, and that's the story that you'll hear where Jesus says, come and follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. And he had faith to leave all of that behind and follow Jesus. He was the one who had the faith to walk out on the water to the Jesus. And even earlier in this evening, when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he was so passionate that he asked Jesus to wash his whole body. Like he was just all in. We see this come out in Luke 22. Simon is also Peter because names in the Bible can be confusing. So just know, Simon and Peter, same person. Simon, Simon, Jesus said, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. So this guy talks a good game. But Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. And that's what went on to happen. The same Peter had just been like, I'm with you to prison and to death. When they take Jesus away 3 different times, someone asks if he was with Jesus, and he says, I didn't even know him. He was so quick to desert this person that he said he was with, like ride or die. And in fact, after Jesus' resurrection, he goes and finds Peter back on a boat. He had just gone back to what he had been doing before, back fishing, back just living that normal life, not chasing after what Jesus had brought him into. He was a deserter at a table with some mama's boys. But they were all at the table, and that's the point, because Jesus brings broken people to his table. But the beauty of the table is that the people there don't stay broken, because at his table, there's life. When we look at Peter, we see someone who denied even knowing Jesus, becoming the person on whom the church was built. It says in Matthew 16, this verse we've talked about over and over in this series, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. This man who had run away to go back to fishing ended up giving the rest of his life to build the church, because he had found life in Jesus and he wanted other people to have it. And to the point where he gave his life for the sake of the church. Tradition says that he was crucified for his faith, and that he asked to be hung upside down because he didn't even see himself worthy of being killed the same way that Jesus was. Peter went from being a deserter to someone who was willing to lay his life down because he found life at the table. And that's not all. At his table, there's love. We look at James and John and these epitome of angry people that you wouldn't necessarily want to eat a meal with, and yet they became known for their love. James went on to be the first apostle to be martyred, the first one killed for his faith, and he didn't fight back. He allowed it to happen. And then John became known as the apostle of love. He's the one who wrote the Gospel of John and the 3 epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. And all throughout those, he's talking about love all the time. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son for us. For God so loved the world. He talked over and over about love because he had been changed. They came in broken, but they found life at the table, and they found love at the table. And they didn't find Pastor Jon at the table, but we're going to find him on stage right now. How about that segue?
Well done. At this table, there's also family. John moves from angry to love. Peter moves from deserter to loyal to death. But at this table, there's family, and it's a messed up family. So I love this picture so much. You know, it's funny that this actual painting was originally discovered because it was a mural that was placed in a cafeteria of some old ancient building, and it had been covered up, and they tried to protect it as much as possible. And what's been fascinating about this picture is that Leonardo's been able to, I know I'm on a first name basis, he was able to capture a moment of chaos. Pastor Ashley mentioned it earlier. This is the moment that Jesus is telling them that someone would betray him. And yet, he captures it in a sense of beauty. Notice the symmetry. Notice that every stroke in this painting lives in perfect unity with the other stroke, that the colors are just phenomenal. The story communicated in this moment is beautiful, and yet there's chaos. Why that speaks to my heart is when you consider the people at the table and their brokenness, when you consider that there's people who struggled with anger and people who had different political opinions and people who had no business being at this table. This is still the same table that's responsible for a good majority of the scripture you have in your hand today. We don't celebrate who Jesus is as a collective community if some of these men and some of the women that weren't represented in this picture leave this moment and become obsessed with spreading the gospel to the known ends of the earth. Yes, they are broken, but with Jesus, life is found. Not only life is found, but love is found. Not only is life and love found, but family is found. And when family is found, there is something that happens when we find our place at this table. So here at Center City, as we've been exploring this last several weeks and been talking about this Move series, one of the things that we always say, a value of ours, is that Center City will always move together. We will always move together. It's the reason why we say that Center City is always open and never full. You know, one of the things that we celebrate and collectively celebrate as a church is today there's over 141 unique people that are connected to Center City groups. As much as I love Sunday morning, we are not a church that does small groups. We are a collection of people in groups that come together on Sunday morning and celebrate all that God is doing. We want you to find a place to belong, a group of people to do life with. There's one person in the painting that every time I do this study messes me up. I get a little bit in my flesh when I consider Judas. I get a little bit in my flesh. If I'm being honest, I get a little bit in my flesh because it's one thing. There's some people that I have tension with that from time to time they come around the table and that tension is tough. But could you imagine what it was like to not only have tension with somebody, but to know that the person who was sitting next to you was a betrayer? You feel me? That thing that wells up in you. That's right. That thing that wells up in you. That thing, that call for justice. That frustration. I can't believe that they would have the audacity. That they would have the audacity to show up. Luke chapter 22, verse 20 says this: in the same way after supper, he took the cup saying, this is the blood of the new covenant which is poured out for you. So in the moment that Jesus is beginning to explain this new covenant, this is the passage we read often when we're talking through communion, he goes on to say this: but the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. Man, I have so many feelings when I read this, thinking this is the guy who betrayed my Savior. And here's why. Because for many of us, if we're being honest, when we consider our place at this table, if you pop that picture back up, when we consider our place at this table, we like to put ourselves here. Here's the problem. You don't fit here. The truth is, you've betrayed him too. Let's just be honest. You've done the thing that you said you would never do again. You've made the mistake in a moment of weakness. Like all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. If you want to get specific, what Paul says is that he's the chief of all sinners, reminding us that even if we were the type of people that could transform the face of the world, all of us still struggle with brokenness. This table is not yours. And I know the weight of sin has got it in the back of your head sometimes when you consider relationship with God, that you don't deserve to be at this table. And I need you to know, your pastor is confirming that thought. There is nothing you can do to deserve to be at this table. And yet, he calls us to it. He's prepared a place. He's prepared a place. Again, I love this picture, Matthew chapter 26, verses 49 through 50. So Judas came straight to Jesus. Greetings, Rabbi. He exclaimed, and he gave him a kiss. And Jesus says, my friend, go ahead and do what you came to do. For the others grabbed Jesus, and they arrested him. I know it's easy to point fingers at Judas. But it's because, honestly, we forget our place at the table. You know, another picture about a banquet that I like is found in Luke chapter 14. Jesus is speaking, and he replied with a story, which he does quite often. He says this: a man prepared a great feast and sent out many invitations. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to tell all the guests, come to the banquet, it's ready. But they all began making excuses. One said, I've just bought a field and I must inspect it. Please excuse me. He was polite at least. Another says, I've just bought 5 pair of oxen and I want to try them out. Please excuse me. Another said, I just got married so I can't come. He didn't add the please excuse me. The servants returned and told his master what they had said. The master was furious and said, go quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and invite the poor and the cripple and the blind and the lame. And after the servant had done this, he reported that there was still more room. So the master said, go into the country and the lanes and behind the hedges and urge everyone you find to come so that the house will be filled. The power of the table is released when we choose to now bring the broken ourselves. That not only we find our place, but so inspired by the life and the love and the family that we find, that we do the work of bringing others to this table. Aren't you glad that we serve a God who is not satisfied with an empty house? That the house would be filled. And I just need you to know, I need you to know in this room, because I think some of us got this perspective that somehow success in life is a clean house. That the walls aren't marked up and the floors aren't scuffed and that the dishes aren't dirty and the stuff is put away. And I'm not telling you that cleanliness is not bad. Like hear me, I want to make sure I'm clear. But a house is meant to be lived in. The idea that it's full and that there's life and that there's conversation and people are finding hope and finding love and finding family. Is it messy? Absolutely. Are there times where we don't like what's happening? Yes. Are there times where we have to navigate through tension? Absolutely. But that it would set of this house, not that it's clean, not that it's neat and orderly, but that it's full. It's full of life. And it's full of hope, and it's full of little kids dancing in the middle of a worship service, and it's full of teenagers who throw things up against the wall, and it's full with your mess and my mess, because we do life together. There is room at this table, and Center City will always be a place where we move together. Now, hear me. Before we get into some of the practical, there's some of you that when you consider this table, you're struggling a little bit because, quite honestly, the shame of sin has kind of sat on you.